Hey everybody! Welcome to Friday the 13th, the series. I'm your producer Robert,
And I'm your guest, Jeremiah.
and after a complete, spoiler-filled recap of the episode, we are going to discuss the show you either just learned existed or always wondered how it existed. We promise the answers will be few and far between because we're just here to have some goofity fun exploring a show that, despite or possibly even because of its faults, isn't good and isn't so bad it's good, but is still somehow oddly charming. Let's dive in, shall we? Welcome, one and all, to the David Cronenberg episode. After the recap, my old friend Jeremiah is going to break it down with me. He not only works in the film industry, including doing development work on Rogue One, the Marvel Spider-Man films, and Deadpool and Wolverine, but he's a lifelong Friday the 13th the series fan. Uh-oh. As a result, we go even deeper into the weeds than usual, discussing the logistical challenges the show was up against, the ways in which it broke new ground, and finally, its influential legacy. As always, if you want to watch these episodes for free, YouTube's got you covered, and you can find a link on the Inner Demon Entertainment website. Full disclosure, before we begin, there's a period of about 3 minutes shortly after Jeremiah's introduction in which the audio becomes a little noisy, but it does clear up for the rest of the episode. With that unpleasantness behind us, let's get started. Okay, so, Faith Healer. We all know what we're working with here, right? A brick warehouse with the hardwood floors of an Arthur Murray dance studio? Check. The healer and his subject in the center of the room, a row of wheelchair-bound applicants at the front, and the congregation looking down from a circular balcony above? Check. A healer who doesn't claim God is working through him, but is instead positing that God has dropped the ball and now it's up to him to clean up God's mess? Check. No choir, no organ, no psalms, and no hymnals, but instead, an audience watching with the silent, unnerving fixation of the eyes wide shut partygoers if you replace their masks and robes with khakis and cardigans? Check. What's that? This doesn't sound like any faith healing you've ever heard of? Well, I guess you're uninitiated in the Canadian variant. This is what happens when you convert a Southern Fried Tent revival to metric. To get 95% of the way there, imagine a Lutheran congregation forced at gunpoint to worship Satan. I realize I speak with what science has only recently identified as negative inflection, and that makes it impossible to know if I'm being sarcastic or not, so I'm going to state over and over that this whole mountain of wrong actually creates an unnatural air that serves the story and makes this opening scene creepy. Granted, that creepy tone is somewhat undermined by what appear to be tape marks on the floor to align the wheelchairs. Likewise, the pool of applicants seeking the healing touch look like a central casting lineup for a wrongful injury attorney's bus stop advertisement. We've got wheelchairs, crutches, arm braces, neck braces, lady with her face sliding off. Yeah, this is the David Cronenberg episode, folks, and it shows. Not because the episode is so good, but because of the preponderance of body horror. In fact, IMDb lists the episode before and after this one as top episodes, but not this one. And this isn't Cronenberg getting his feet wet. He'd already made The Brood, Scanners, and Videodrome. It's stunning. Nothing in those films is as disturbing as how this episode depicts the removal of contact lenses. Jerry, our protagonist du jour, rises from a wheelchair among the applicants and announces Stuart, our titular faith healer, as he approaches him. Jerry isn't wearing any type of disguise, he was simply sitting in a wheelchair, so we have to presume this is their first encounter. Equally unclear, the relationship between Jerry and the person pushing his wheelchair, whom he will never address or refer to, and who will never be seen again. The now ambulatory Jerry marches up to the stooge in the wheelchair, who is being treated for his cataracts, which must be crazy severe if they've left him paralyzed from the waist down, and peppers him with classic gotcha questions such as, "What color is my hair?" and "What kind of jacket am I wearing?" Truly a cunning gambit, Jerry, but this isn't the Stooge's first rodeo, so he deftly parries by bemoaning the fact that he's blind, and therefore can't reply with any degree of fidelity. Dang, almost got him. Not to be outdone, Jerry has an ace up his sleeve, the certain knowledge that this stooge will sit perfectly still as Jerry reaches into his eyes and removes his fake cataract contact lenses. And now the slant body horror of allowing a stranger to pinch your upper eyelid together from the sides until your contact lens slides down onto his waiting finger. As Patton Oswalt would say, the way nobody does. I'll level with you, gentle listener. As a contact wearer myself, I didn't even know that was physically possible, much less did I ever conceive of trying it. Why all this tedium and not, tossing him an orange he would instinctively catch? None of this makes sense, but it's creepier. I'll give it that. A lot of monocles drop into a lot of champagne flutes in the balcony audience, and we learned Statler and Waldorf were present if they were played by Oliver Platt and Oliver Platt. The stooge must have a get-out-of-jail-free card because the mob descends on Stewart alone. Outside, he runs down an alley like he's auditioning for The Third Man. It's a good-looking shot, but reminds us once again this show is 90% Bowery by weight, and I'm guessing this was filmed within blocks of the Curious Goods Street. I imagine the conversation between the directors of these episodes and the locations department was always something like, I said I didn't want any Bowery and I'm not paying for it. Hey, I'm afraid the Bowery gets installed at the factory. It's really out of our hands. But tell you what, I can knock 10% off the number of park scenes if it'll seal the deal. Stewart must be taking the scenic escape route because he runs a gauntlet of the vengeful and firm who somehow got ahead of him. There's an old man with a cane, a young guy on crutches, an old woman with a walker. Ha! Take that, Canadian healthcare system. And to the young man with the crutches, hey buddy, end of the line. Another 2 weeks and that leg will heal itself. Stewart falls into a run-of-the-mill concrete back alley garbage pit without breaking his neck somehow. He discovers a white glove and, for no reason, puts it on. He acts a bit like it's calling to him, so maybe my former co-host, Hill Street, was right about how the haunted antiques work on this show. Somehow, he's bonked on the head by an old woman with possible leprosy and pinpoint accuracy, despite having eyes swollen shut by something like ocular scabies. If Rorschach's mask was actually a purple birthmark, that's basically what we're dealing with here. Her delivery of, I'm dying, feels like it could be slotted in right after the rooms. I definitely have breast cancer. The trash pit almost claims a second life when, in her hubris, she again swings one of her crutches, slips, and falls on her butt. Groundskeeper Willie really needs to put up a warning sign. Stewart instinctively reaches out with his gloved hand to prevent her pox-ridden body from making contact, and lo and behold, she's healed. In a nice moment of dark irony, Lady Leprosy gets a moment to beg forgiveness from God for having ever doubted him. I guess it's like that old saying, the greatest trick God ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist. When Stewart realizes the glove has become infected, he tries to peel it off and starts to take his own flesh and blood with it, giving us, in effect, Schrodinger's glove, simultaneously a part of him, but still distinct, only revealing which state it's in at the moment it's removed. Fortunately, the Coincidence Express just keeps chugging along, and Stewart wanders across a friendly police officer whose face he touches for seemingly no good reason, turning Officer Friendly into a raisin with pudding oozing out his eyes. The disease transferred, the glove reverts to normal, and Stewart marvels at it for a weirdly long time, especially for a show that often has to race through important plot information, even jamming it into quickly referenced off-screen events when necessary. Similarly, for a show that often feels like it was shot under a rush production schedule, it's stunning. Every new director seems to have been allowed to shoot a new establishing shot of Curious Goods, and Cronenberg was apparently no exception. Inside, Mickey and Ryan try to watch scrambled porn on the kind of television you actually had to tune in order to watch. Yes, kids, it truly was the Dark Ages. Mickey's hair is back to Kool-Aid Berry Blast Red, which has me wondering if these aired in a different order than they were filmed. Ryan the Lion is so lost to shadow, save his pale white hand and face, it feels like we caught Pee-wee's Zombie trying to tune the box he lives in. Ryan stumbles across Stewart on TV, televangelizing, and Mickey and Ryan are simultaneously completely disinterested, yet choose to record him, presumably as a plot contrivance, as Jack will later need to play the tape for Jerry. Speaking of Crackerjack Marshak, my man wanders in and immediately recognizes Stewart's glove, aka the Sforza glove. Turns out, Jack brought it back from Rome when he was a merchant marine. Jack, you just keep getting cooler and cooler. And the glove is a Paisan. In an overly complicated bit of backstory, we learn it's from the time of Da Vinci, but not by Da Vinci. Made for alchemist Antonio Sforza, but not by Antonio Sforza. No. It was made by his court physician. Listen, show, I see what you were going for with the physician angle, but does it really make more sense the magic item was created by a doctor and not a science magician? The show wisely yada yadas past the decision to reclaim the glove, opting to jump straight to Jack's failed first attempt. In what was probably a logistical decision to reuse a location, Jack is escorted down the Bowery staircase we saw earlier by Stewart's newly hired goons. Nice line by Jack. What kind of people would bend a man's lockpicks? Speaks volumes about what we didn't see because of the cut. In a fun little bit of business, while Jack, Mickey, and Ryan strategize, Ryan attempts to straighten Jack's bent lockpick set. When Jack takes off to once again attempt to solve the whole problem by himself, I think Mickey checks her mark when scooching closer to Ryan to fill the gap. Now for one of my patented, I had to watch this half a dozen times before I knew what I saw moments. Mickey and Ryan the Lion appear to make themselves comfortable leaning against what's probably the hood of the Winchester mobile as they prepare to execute plan, watch for Stewart to slip out the back. Then we cut to a fascinating, almost M.C. Escher-esque wide shot of fire escapes. During the original TV broadcast, perhaps I would have been able to see that Mickey and Ryan are now standing on one of said fire escapes, but I thought this was simply a transitional shot to indicate both the passage of time and their view of the back alley from their spot near the car, where they seemed to just indicate with their body language they were going to remain. In fact, because they both turn around, I thought we were now getting a shot of their new POV. It doesn't help we then cut to a nice low-angle shot of Mickey and Ryan, but it's too tight for them to reveal they're now on the fire escape, so I thought they were still by the car. You know, because transporting them via a cut would feel jarring. After a few riveting moments spent watching our heroes bravely kill time while Jack attempts to break in, off-screen, Stewart appears on the fire escape below them, and my world flipped upside down as I quickly reoriented my geography. Yes, obviously they're going to covertly track the man by tailing him down a fire escape. Why didn't I see it sooner? Oh, you lost him because you waited above him instead of watching from across the street? Imagine that. A woman with a poodle steps out into Crime Alley through a jail cell door, just go with it, and the dog runs off. Stewart, his glove fully loaded with plague, catches it by the leash, taking pains not to touch it, as that would beg the question, can he just pass the sickness to the dog? Instead, he kills the lady, of course, and she, like everyone else, dies by anaphylactic shock over what feels like an eternity of screen time. Personally, this being Cronenberg, I'm just waiting for someone's head to explode. But no, she dies like a suffocating fish, tongue moving, cheeks bulging, but not in the way you're picturing. They took the time for makeup effects and prosthetics here, which is probably why it goes on too long. To give us something to cut away to, we mirror her overstretched death with lingering shots of Stewart exulting in the power of his glove, which fills the foreground and seems weirdly inflated with air. Honestly, Ryan's earlier comment aside, the glove reminds me less of Michael Jackson and more of Howie Mandel. As usual, Mickey and Ryan arrive too late and discover a corpse that looks like a first pass at the aliens from They Live. I hate to blame the victim, but if you're going to live in Crime Alley, maybe invest in a more intimidating dog than Mopsy, the French poodle. All right, Jeremiah, you want to tell the folks at home how we know each other?
Well, we met way too many years ago at USC. You were joining a fraternity that I had not been a member of, but had sort of been oddly adopted by.
If anything, the fraternity joined you, I think.
That's a better phrasing of it, for sure. You were studying engineering, and I was obviously in the film school, and I was actually technically double majoring in film and business in case if the whole film thing didn't fall out. But I actually even started out, and I don't know if you knew this or would remember this, maybe it came up. I wanted to get a second major just to have something that felt more secure to fall back on if I needed it, being the first person to go to college, being someone who sort of my family was going to financially depend upon. I wanted to have something that I knew could translate into a career.
Very sensible.
I actually started off double majoring in physics and then realized that trying to do physics and film and trying to get that done within the timeline of my scholarship running out would have been impossible. And what am I really going to do with physics? So I decided to pick something that at least could have some tangential applications to what I wanted to do, which was be in the film industry. And at least business has overlap, because business, I guess, has overlap with everything in America, for better or worse.
I suggest everyone does a podcast just to get to know their own friends better. I honestly don't think I was aware that you were ever a physics major.
You were an electrical engineer, and you were very interested in film.
Yeah, I was foolishly pursuing education for its own sake with the EE degree, but my heart was always in film. So yeah, I soon found myself hanging out with you and really a lot of guys from the film school, since there were a number of us in the house. That would be the fraternity, to those of you who are uninitiated.
At the time, I was sort of show running and one of the producers and lead director on a sketch comedy show, and you used to take a lot of interest in that and volunteer to PA and to pitch and occasionally write a sketch.
Now that you bring it up, obviously I remember doing it, but I haven't thought about working on USC's sketch comedy show in a very long time.
It might be for the best that you don't dwell on it too much.
We won't lead with that. We'll bury this somewhere in the middle of the episode.
It's a little bit like the scene from The Player where Tim Robbins is having dinner with all these Hollywood people, and it's like, can we talk about anything but the film industry? And I find myself occasionally getting to that place. So I think the fact that like that wasn't the only thing you were doing at USC actually helped broaden the conversations that we would have quite a bit.
Let's go way, way back. How is it exactly you discovered horror?
Oh boy. So it's funny. My parents were very liberal. You know, hey kids, you like cartoons, right? I think there's some cartoon segments in this movie called Pink Floyd The Wall. Maybe you'll find that entertaining. Or, oh yeah, that heavy metal. That's a cartoon movie that we can all enjoy, right, kids?
Keep in mind, folks at home, this is at a time when they made a Saturday morning cartoon show for kids out of RoboCop. When you can go into Toys R Us and buy Rambo toys for your 5-year-olds.
Yeah, there's a Rambo cartoon out at that time. That's very true. My first introduction, I guess, is probably Scooby-Doo.
I'll allow it.
But really, I did very young watch Twilight Zone and Dark Shadows.
Yeah, I watch Twilight Zone in the evenings too.
Yeah. Twilight Zone is still one of my favorite series of all time. It's one of the greatest series of all time, period. Like, it's just hard to argue with that.
Absolutely.
Thinking like maybe Creepshow was pretty early on, the movies, Creepshow 1 and 2. And then Cat's Eye. It's interesting thinking about it that all of those are anthology movies, and in a way, Friday the 13th is sort of a mix of anthology and serialized television.
That's a good point.
The video library that we were creating was pretty extensive at the time, and I would always try to like find a way to index things together. Let's stick Little Shop of Horrors on with Rick Moranis and Steve Martin doing a cameo in it, and then when Blue Heaven comes out, I'll add that as the second movie on that tape. Every now and then it would sort of annoy me, actually, when like a movie would get a sequel that I wasn't expecting. And I'm like, oh, but there's already 2 other movies on that VHS tape with the first Gremlins or what have you. Yeah.
This is why your resume still says VHS optimization expert.
Right, exactly. I think a lot of the Stephen King stuff I came into early. I discovered Shining and Psycho and Rosemary's Baby fairly early, and those are all remained high on my list. Shining is my favorite horror film to this day. Kubrick's my favorite director to this day. Not necessarily just because of Shining.
But specifically because of Dr. Strangelove.
Actually, yeah, I mean, that is my favorite Kubrick film.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't a question. I was just telling the folks at home.
Any one of them, maybe with just a couple exceptions, are going to be in my top 50 and probably in my top 5 for any genre that it happens to be in.
Yeah, every film in his oeuvre an argument for greatest film of all time.
Right, absolutely.
Do you recall, did any of these films actually give you nightmares?
So here's what's funny.
I'm laughing already.
Yes, 2 stories, and The Shining was a part of this. When they were going to watch a horror movie, I would be in the next room. Obviously, the sound would still come through the walls. So I remember hearing The Shining music and not knowing what this creepy music is accompanying. And therefore, my imagination was going wild.
Yeah, music's a powerful force.
So I remember that. I also remember Nightmare on Elm Street 2. My uncle watching that and hearing, I think particularly like the pool scene. Again, it was this thing where I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. So I'm sort of filling in the gaps in my head.
Stupid kids and their vivid imaginations.
Yeah, oddly enough, and this was actually quite a few years later, but I watched Children of the Corn at a sleepover where we did not sleep at all. And when I did finally go to sleep, 4 to 8 hours later, probably more based on the lack of sleep than the movie itself, I had specific nightmares about Children of the Corn. Freddy was sort of my 80s slasher. He's still my 80s slasher, I guess. I think the first Halloween is amazing and is among one of the best, but as far as a character goes, as far as a franchise goes, Nightmare on Elm Street would be the one that I just personally love, even though many of those films are not good. But
that's big of you to say.
The charm of even the bad ones wins me over, and the ones that are good are great. But even the bad ones, they win me over. I have the same feeling with like Planet of the Apes. Like even the bad Planet of the Apes movies, they just got a charm to them where they win me over.
If you've ever listened to the intro to this very podcast, I share a similar sentiment regarding Friday the 13th, the series.
Another thing that was very early in my discovery of horror was Friday the 13th series. You know, I actually watched it as a kid.
Right. You're one of the few people coming on this podcast that actually can answer the question, what was your knowledge of Friday the 13th, the series, before the podcast, with something more than there was no knowledge before the podcast.
Yeah, in my case, I was very aware of it.
You saw many episodes as a kid, but not the preponderance. Not the majority, right?
TV back then was obviously tricky because you got to catch it when it's live.
Yeah.
And the nature of how that show was aired and how syndication was handled in general meant that it was playing in different times, and times would switch and channels would switch sometimes. So you might turn on a channel expecting to see it and not see it, and then you would turn on the channel some random time and be like, oh, it's playing now. Wow, that's surprising. There were several episodes I saw multiple times without ever seeing the pilot once.
And just lost. Couldn't make heads or tails of it.
Initially, it was on in my area after Saturday Night Live, if I remember correctly.
About 1 in the morning?
Yeah, in the Midwest, Saturday Night Live was 10:30 to midnight instead of 11:30 to 1. And then later on, it moved around. There was a point where it was on like Saturday during the day, maybe more around like 5 or 6 o'clock. But yeah, I really liked the show. You know, as I said, there's something about things that sort of have a little bit of an anthology slant to it that I find charming. I guess similar to a Bad Freddy movie or a Bad Apes movie. But oddly enough, as a kid, I tended to be more drawn to what we would now call, I guess, elevated horror. I didn't find a lot of pleasure in like the actual Friday the 13th movies. I wasn't really into it. Actually, as I've gotten older, I see more fun in things like that. I still prefer Your Shining, Your Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, The Witch. But that said, Friday the 13th, the series, despite having a lot of schlock, I did enjoy that out the gate and still do.
What would you compare Friday the 13th, the series, to?
It's really something that, in a way, it doesn't get enough credit because, and I can't say with absolute factual certainty that it's the first of its kind, but it's certainly a leader in its kind. When you look at genre TV, particularly horror TV, and maybe up until just more recent years, it tends to always have been sort of an anthology approach. Twilight Zone, every episode's different. Tales from the Crypt, every episode's different. Tales from Dark Side, every episode's different. They're all standalone.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Tales from the Dark Side, which I've never actually seen. It was going to be a question.
Yeah, Tales from Dark Side was very similar to Twilight Zone or Outer Limits. It leaned very clearly on horror, whereas Twilight Zone almost sort of presented itself as a sci-fi series, even though there was a lot of horror to it. You could easily put it as a sci-fi series. Tales from Dark Side, much like Tales from the Crypt, wanted to be seen as a horror thing specifically.
Chasing the horror demo.
You had a host in the case of the Twilight Zone or Tales from the Crypt to kick things off. But then each story contained within an episode was its own story that could do its own thing and would have its own unique characters. And Friday the 13th was a leader in establishing this mixture of, we're going to have an ongoing plot and we're going to have characters that continue throughout the show, but within that, most of the episodes are really going to have very little to do with these characters. If these episodes were a standalone movie and this was the first time you were reading the script for that movie, you would think sometimes that Mickey and Ryan and Jack were a little bit lower down the list compared to the people who are getting the cursed item or dealing with the cursed item or being threatened by the cursed item. A lot of times the stories are independently about those characters and really exploring them.
Yeah, the co-stars and day players almost get top billing in some episodes.
But yeah, it really mixed both in a way that at the time was pretty novel, but has since then become the way that a lot of horror shows go. Because basically, if you're not an anthology show like a Tales from the Crypt, you're probably a show that blends anthology and serialized drama the way that Friday the 13th does, and they just weren't doing that before Friday the 13th. This is something that X-Files did. This is something
You took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say X-Files, Supernatural.
Yeah, 100%. Even genre TV that isn't horror, like early seasons of Smallville, basically took this model to the point that if you look at season 1 of Smallville, you see cues and similarities to Friday the 13th more so than any Superman story or any Superman comic.
Is there an episode off the top of your head you can think of? An example you can cite?
Well, that's the thing, is in a similar way, that first season was a Monster of the Week show. So almost every episode sort of did it. And almost every episode would sort of focus on a kid or a coach that worked at school. And you'd spend half the episode with that character and what his home life is like or her home life is like and what she's longing for before she gets this power. It in many ways is structured like Friday the 13th series in the first couple seasons in particular. And you even listen to like some of the music cues in the first season or two of Smallville, and it sounds like the type of music that you would hear in a Friday the 13th episode. It still gets referenced, and and I work in the film industry, and it's even something that's come up randomly at meetings where people are pitching a show or talking about a show or saying that Friday the 13th series type of formula, and we'll actually reference Friday the 13th series.
You're kidding.
I mean, I had a specific show that I worked on was based on a young adult book that was pretty popular. One of the first things that the producer cited, hey, have you ever seen Friday the 13th series? And I was like, yeah, I have the box set on DVD. I've watched as a kid. I've seen it since.
I'm just going to go ahead and pull a line from Christmas Vacation. Jeremiah, if I woke up tomorrow with my head sewn to the carpet, I wouldn't be more surprised than I am right now.
It was a cheaply made show for the type of show it was trying to be, which is a 1-hour drama, fully filmed, single camera. Most shows with that budget are studio shows, filmed in front of a live studio audience very cheaply. They're not scripted, they're talk shows, they're things like that. That's the type of thing that the syndicated market was often focusing on. So to have a fully produced 45-minute episode coming out 20 to 24 weeks a year is something that is very difficult to do, and even more so without resources. But it did fairly well, which is shocking. And it did change some things in the industry in a strange way. I mean, not it specifically, but, I've heard you often talk about it going to Canada. But it was sort of a leader in that.
You just took the question right out of my mouth again. I was just about to ask, are you familiar with The Littlest Hobo, or maybe more likely SCTV, or any other Canadian TV shows?
Oh, SCTV, 100%. And I actually watched SCTV as a kid. So one slight misinterpretation on, I think, this show is that it was filmed in Canada, but it was still very much a Hollywood show.
Yes.
At the time, the relationship wasn't quite as clear-cut as what it became after it. So that's sort of where it falls into. It's kind of a Hollywood show, kind of a Canadian show. But shortly after that, you had a wave of shows. They would just call themselves Hollywood shows. They were no different than any other Hollywood show, but they would film in Canada.
So it was a forerunner of runaway production in Hollywood?
There's always been a show here or there that would go and film in Canada. It's been that way since the 1950s. But it would be like one show, out of all the shows on TV. I think one of the first ones was like Hawkeye and the Last Mohicans, which was from like the 1950s. So there were little drips and drabs of like a show going to Canada. But the start of the revolution was MacGyver in 1985, I believe, that got people to go, oh, that seems like a good idea. So then in 1987, the next shows to really do it were 21 Jump Street and Friday the 13th series. Ever since then, X-Files filmed in Canada. We talked about Smallville and Supernatural, those filmed in Canada. Every Arrowverse DC television show films in Canada. Most of your single camera 1-hour dramas post 1987, when Friday the 13th started doing it and 21 Jump Street started doing it, you can throw a dart at a list of shows that are 1-hour long dramas, and you got a good chance of hitting one that was filmed up in Canada.
Hey, it's only fair. I mean, Canada needs a second industry. It can't all be shale mining.
Too true.
Since you mentioned MacGyver, one of our cast members, in fact, Stuart, our titular faith healer, played by the actor Miguel Fernandez, actually worked on MacGyver and, oddly enough, Stargate SG-1. And I wondered, did Richard Dean Anderson remember him when he showed up on the set of Stargate?
I'm going to say no, if this is the...
Oh, you bite your tongue. That man has a mind like a steel trap. Never forgets a face.
Unless if they were good pals, maybe, or were drinking buddies afterwards, but probably not.
Turns out Richard Dean Anderson has stories he can tell, much like Eddie Murphy's brother on The Chappelle Show. Turns out him and Miguel Fernandez have the wildest stories you've ever heard.
Or maybe Richard Dean Anderson's brother could be on The Chappelle Show.
I like to think so.
Yeah, somehow Rick James is still involved in all of them, though. On the downside, because it was an early adapter to moving to Canada, actually this is an assumption on my part, could be totally wrong, but I would assume that being one of the first means that you don't have all the talent that will eventually move to Canada in terms of your cameramen and operators and production crew and location scouts and things like that. And probably by the time Friday the 13th is going off the air is probably when it really hit its stride. Probably didn't have a lot of those benefits that some of the later shows that followed had.
I can't speak to below the line talent, but I actually kind of was under the impression that one of Canada's greatest natural resources was on-air talent.
Were those people that would then stay in Canada, or would they move to Hollywood?
Well, funny you mention that. I guess I have to bring up a quick anecdote from John Candy. So one time John Candy flies back to Canada, and the taxi driver at the airport asks him, how come you big stars that get famous here always move down to Hollywood? And he says, I still live in my home right here in Toronto. And the response is, oh, I'm sorry. I thought you got famous.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Very true.
So I'll ask you the $1 million question. Let's just go ahead and pull this Band-Aid off. Am I too hard on Friday the 13th, the series?
Yes and no, probably. I mean, in the bigger scheme of things, no, because you're having fun with it, and it's there to be had fun with. And it was a run and gun, low budget show that was doing the best it could, but it had limited time, limited resources, and there are definitely areas where that shows, especially sometimes when things are like translating from something that probably looked really good on the page, but now we have to execute it, and we have to execute it quickly, and we don't have time to fuss or plan it or rearrange it or rewrite it when we realize it's better on paper than what it is practically.
Yeah, speaking of USC surfing channels, there are times when I legitimately think we were operating at a higher level.
Right. Well,
And that is really saying something, Jeremiah.
yeah, but there was definitely some flaws in that system too. I also think, is it any more schlocky, or are the faults any more present than, again, not the elevated horror of the time, but the average horror of the time, which the average horror movie would have more time, would have more budget, would have time to maybe do at least some rewrites, or at least more so than what a weekly television series will do.
Your Friday the 13th part 5s.
Basically, the Friday the 13th movie franchise. Is the series more schlocky, more faulty, more logically something got lost, or we didn't really film this in the right way to communicate it properly? Does it have more of those flaws than the movie series? Because while the movie series was a relatively low-budget series in Hollywood terms, it was certainly more well-funded and had more time to film and had more time to work out logistical issues and story issues and performance issues than a weekly television series that basically has to shoot half a movie this week and then quickly move on to the next one. And half the crew is already working on the next one while they're trying to do this one. Does it really have way less quality than most films in the genre? I don't know. The other thing I think is true, it wasn't ever shot in a fancy stylistic way because it wasn't a hurry. But when you look at the look of it, it was trying to do something unique for television. And a lot of it doesn't translate because the show's never really been remastered. When you're watching a show, if it looked great on TV at the time, but it's a lot of underlighting, a lot of dark exposure and dark shadows, a lot of that style and nuance just ends up looking kind of grainy on a 4K or 1080 TV or computer monitor without it getting a remaster. So
I lost an entire corpse to shadows in the last episode.
But I'm gonna bet, and I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet that corpse was very viewable if you're watching a 1987 television set.
Most likely.
If it was a flatly lit, brightly lit show, you'd still want it to be remastered to not look terrible on your TV these days. But it would be a little bit more passable, whereas this, not so much.
So folks at home, if you know anyone at Shout Factory, put in the word on our behalf.
Yeah, let's go Blu-ray. I don't know if we need 4K, but let's go blue.
Why not?
If you like the horror genre as much as we do, you can preview the horror comic book Requiem for a Psychopath right now for free at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. Imagine a world in which horror film slashers are real. Then imagine a troubled teen bringing one out of retirement to help him take revenge on his bullies. It was written by me and drawn by friend of the show, Stephen Yu. Again, that's Requiem for a Psychopath on the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And, if you dig it, please either review and rate it 5 stars on Amazon, or don't rate and review it at all. Ratings of less than 5 stars send the algorithm into murder mode for some reason. Thanks. I hope you enjoy it.
We haven't even started talking about the show yet, and it's already time for everyone's favorite game, church or basketball court. What is this first location, Jeremiah?
Yeah, that was actually one of my comments as well. And as an extension of that, trying to figure out exactly what the scam is. Because it's, you know, we've seen these con man, faith healer, preacher things represented in media and in real life, I guess, before. And
You feel like this is something you should be comfortable with.
Yeah.
We know how a sham faith healer tent revival works, right? This is a vernacular we all speak.
Yeah, and it's usually a big crowd. They're really into it. This is like an open space where You got one side with a bunch of sick people and people that are looking to get cured, I guess.
All of our elderly and infirmed are standing at the back like they're a choir, and for some reason, our faith healer and his subject slash stooge are in the very middle on what appears to be the half-court line based on the hardwood floor. And there is a congregation, but they're up in the balcony that encircles the entire floor?
Well, they're in the crow's nest. The way that was originally intended was usually that the crow's nest were for the marginalized people to go sit. I guess in this presentation, it's the opposite because it's the...
Well, in some religions, the marginalized population is the female population.
That's true. That's very true. But so it's sort of like, okay, well, are these the rich whales up in this crow's nest seating? But no, you scan up to the crowd and like some of them wearing sweats, the church. And
there's Oliver Platt sitting next to Oliver Platt.
Yeah, like it's not a ton of people, so you're not getting it based on, none of them had money, but I swindled, 1,000 people out of $5 each. So that was a good day. And it's not a wealthy crowd. Even the people that are sick, they all look disheveled. So I'm not really sure how he's planning on getting anything from this crowd, even if he does convince them. There could have been an interesting twist on that. We're used to seeing these faith healers being con men just looking for a quick buck. What if it's somebody sort of looking for the glory of being seen as a holy man? What if it's more of an ego-driven thing?
Well, I would argue he almost is, because in listening to his speech a few times, it almost seems like he's blasphemous. Like he's saying, God dropped the ball, I have the power. Not the Lord is working through me, but no. Yours is a false God. I'm the one you should put your faith in.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. That is part of how, not that I've ever been a carny faith healer myself, but I do think that is part of the way how...
No, just a stooge, Jeremiah.
Yes, constantly. I am the 3-card Monty assistant every day.
Well, really, you pioneered cataracts in a wheelchair. They stole your bit.
I'm the originator. I don't think necessarily every televangelist is being even initially nor primarily motivated by the con of getting rich as much as how good it feels to be seen as important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very real thing and could be said of about 99% of traditional martial arts instructors.
Oh, yeah.
They're not getting rich. It's the ego trip of just having this very small cult that'll do whatever you say.
Very true. Very true. The con itself is a little questionable. He's obviously got expenses. He's got his partners in crime, posing as people who are going to get healed that he obviously has to split the money with, I guess, in some way. He has like assistants / bouncers that seem to be helping him out.
Well, since you broached that subject, you tell me, the man in the wheelchair has to be a stooge.
Yes.
There's no other way we can look at that, right?
Yeah, he's definitely a stooge. I'm guessing the old lady pushing the wheelchair is part of it.
Possible second stooge when his plan comes unraveled. There is zero interaction between them, and it seems like everyone's ire is completely directed at him, but they don't seem to grasp the fact that clearly the guy pretending to have cataracts is one of his flunkies.
I do kind of want to know what Cataracts Man, what his story is, because somehow he got drawn in on this. Was he all in? It could have been his master plan for all we know. What happens to him after this? Was he a one-time stooge? Is he a normal partner in these scams that he does from city to city or something? We never see him again, and no one threatens him with violence. He literally just stays in the wheelchair, which, speaking of that, is he blind or is he crippled? Because he only talks about having cataracts.
Thank you. You saved me the trouble. I was worried I was going to get pushback when I started bringing up these points, but you're actually one step ahead of me. Yes. Why does a man with cataracts have a wheelchair and a cane, Jeremiah?
I do not know. If you're just watching it as enjoyment, you're probably not even going to think about that. Now that's
oh no, man.
That's not an excuse for like the writers and the crew not to think about it. Maybe to some degree it adds to the ambiance, and maybe to some degree it adds to this world where these people are such suckers that they don't question it.
Hey, go ahead and free associate.
We grew up in a generation where we all knew pro wrestling was fake. But, you go back into previous generations and, I know people in my family that thought it was real. I guess people were just so committed to believing it.
Yes, and Jeremiah, I will see your wanting to believe and raise you a Nigerian prince scam. If you're going to run a con, you don't want people that are going to go well down the road with you and then object when you actually spring the ask on them. You want the stupidest of the stupid.
Yeah, and cataracts putting you in a wheelchair is maybe
a test,
a good test for that, right? So
he's also a Nigerian prince, oddly enough.
Yeah.
Despite being the whitest man you've ever seen.
Yeah.
You're going with headcanon, and I'm going to just focus on what's actually in the scene and give it some praise in terms of, I'm going to say that these people's Lutheran level of reservedness actually makes the scene creepier because it's so awkward and unnatural. It almost reminds me of what I've said about Assault on Precinct 13, for example, where instead of having these gang members outside whooping and hollering and riding their motorcycles around, they're just standing like a human fence in absolute silence, staring the way nobody does, but it's the unnaturalness of it that actually makes it creepy.
The ambiance is right, even if the logic isn't.
I don't know what it was, but there was something weird about his eyes being just closed to slits, but you can see the contacts, but the cataract looks more like some kind of weird nodule on his eyelid, not on his eye itself. And I mean, it might be because the actor in the wheelchair has his mouth slightly parted, and it basically just looks like the Corinthian from the Sandman to me.
Especially back in those days, a big complaint with people wearing special eye effects, how terrible it was on the actor. So I could see it being something where the actor probably had a hard time being wide-eyed and opened, but that sort of made it kind of creepy in a way that Cronenberg probably leaned in on.
Truly a happy accident. Yeah, with Cronenberg at the helm, I'm willing to believe that.
Because it was creepy, and like that shot on that stooge actor, it was a very Cronenberg shot. But the taking out of the contacts was like, who is sitting here and letting you do this?
Speaking of unnatural.
Especially when they know that it will expose them.
Right. First, Jerry is going to accuse you of being able to see by asking you questions. What color is my hair? Or what does my suit look like? Etc.
What did he think was going to be the result of that? like he's going to slip up on that alone?
Yeah.
When he's like, well, I can't see. I almost expected it throughout to like turn on Jerry right then. It's like, Jerry, you had one shot. You had one opportunity to expose him, and you spin it by trying to trick him into identifying your clothes.
And your backup plan was, if that doesn't work, I know, this guy will probably just let a stranger reach into his eyes and take out his contacts.
Yeah, the logistics of that. I mean, I find it disturbing because I have a little bit of a phobia about things in my eyes.
Wait, I think I got it, Jeremiah. I think I put it together. The reason why he's in a wheelchair is because he's actually in a wheelchair. The cataracts, yes, that's a con, but that's why he doesn't just get up and run away and sits there and lets a man take his contacts out.
Oh, so he can't cure the man of his inability to walk, but he can seduce him into helping him con people by curing him of his blindness.
Exactly.
But then no one will ask, well, hey, since you did that, why not also make him walk, God?
Like you said, he brought in the stupidest of the stupid.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a fun idea. The other thing with the logistics of it is nobody from that crow's nest seat that he's really exposing this guy to is close enough to either really see the cataracts in the first place, and certainly,
especially when he's in front of half of them.
Yeah, and certainly not close enough to see Jerry lift up on his finger a contact that's basically just a clear piece of plastic with a little white smudge in the middle. Like, you're not close enough to see that he's actually holding a contact.
Very true.
The camera is not even close enough to see that he's holding an actual contact. And the camera is a lot closer than the audience. Logistics of how we wrote this in the script versus how this really works on set. There's a problem there that they did not spend a lot of time resolving.
There's so much wrong in this scene. It's actually kind of stunning.
But I will say the oddities of it is also very Cronenberg, especially the films he was doing at that time. There's a lot of sort of unnatural, odd behavior that you find in classic Cronenberg films.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Cataract's head could have exploded and I wouldn't have batted an eye.
Along those lines, the guy who plays the skeptical debunker, Jerry, he's a guy who is in a lot of Cronenberg stuff.
Okay, you got there first, yeah. His name is Robert A. Silverman. His history with Cronenberg goes all the way back to Rabid. Then he was in The Brood, Scanners, Naked Lunch, and Existence. I'll ask as delicately as I can. Did he suffer a stroke at some point?
If you're asking, is that why he is giving the performance that he's giving? I mean, if he did it before The Brood. I'm not sure if when the faith healer preacher says this man's drunk, if he's actually supposed to be telling the truth there or not. Because he kind of acts a little drunk, obviously, but then as we see later, that's just how he talks.
Right.
You know, I mean, Cronenberg's sort of very known, though, for interesting acting choices and sort of finding an odd performance to be what he's going for.
Yeah, I kind of assumed it was a conscious choice because he put him in 5 of his films, and I don't think Hollywood was demanding that he cast Robert A. Silverman in all his projects to put butts in seats.
He's also very interested in flesh and things of the human condition. So if he did suffer from something as an actor, I could see Cronenberg thinking that that's fascinating. It's all the more impressive that, you know, you're able to do this job and perform.
Yes, Cronenberg and David Lynch have much to discuss.
Yes, big time. Cut from very similar cloths.
So outside, there's actually a pretty nice shot that almost reminded me of something out of The Third Man. Did you find it as comical as I did? The way he just keeps encountering people suffering from ailments who now want a piece of him? I feel like there was almost a Nordberg level of getting shot, then stepping in the bear trap, then going face first into the wedding cake.
Yes, it was comical. Designed to be so, though. But it was also fun to think about the fact that it's specifically the sickly people that caught up with him. Not all the healthy people who he was obviously trying to rip off that were sitting up in the crow's nest. It's all the people who can barely walk, barely run. And I don't see any ramps by any of the places where they're at.
No, they're in an industrial district.
3 of them are literally standing at the bottom of a staircase.
Why is the young, able-bodied guy that seems to maybe just have a broken leg and could really just wait it out a couple weeks and he'd be fine, hanging out with like 2 elderly people?
Yeah.
And speaking of a terrible environment for the disabled, he quickly falls into like a concrete garbage ditch, I don't know what else to call it, and discovers the glove that's going to be the cursed item for this episode. And I suddenly picture this as a very George Costanza moment. So you were sitting in some garbage and you thought, I know, I'll just put this piece of garbage on my hand. I know, Jerry, no, it was hovering. It was hovering above the other garbage.
Did it have a bite taken out of it?
Yes.
Then it's garbage. Clearly, the devil is playing 3D chess while all the rest of us are playing checkers, because somehow that glove got there. When it knows who it wants to be with, it does call to them. That's my interpretation.
Well, the first thing I thought when I saw that haunted mulcher was, oh yeah, this definitely feels like Lord of the Rings.
Right. There was one mulcher to rule them all.
So Jerry gets bonked on the head by an old woman with leprosy, maybe? And this kind of gets into what we were saying about information being lost in the shadows, because due to the heavy makeup effects, it looks like she should be blind too. Everyone in this episode has their eyes almost closed, but not quite, I guess.
I just saw her as having some sort of skin disease and...
Well, I mean, the logic of this show, Jeremiah, has taught me. I see a woman covered in scabies, and I think, oh, obviously she has cataracts.
Yes, that's very true. That's very true. But one thing with that woman is I did have the thought, would there have been something to gain from seeing her again later in the show?
Probably.
You know, because he does cure her, and she instantly starts thanking God for curing her when it's really the devil that did it.
Praise be to Satan.
Does she join in the con job going forward now that it is real? Or somebody that would then fall victim to a never-cursed object or something like that? Like, it would have been interesting to sort of follow up on that lady if the show had the time and was that type of show.
I think we can safely put that in the missed opportunity category.
A missed opportunity and just something that, yeah, they didn't have time or the thought to develop.
Like her also mentioning, oh, and you fixed my broken coccyx because I just fell hard on my butt on concrete.
Yeah, very true.
And then it gets weird, which is really saying something, because he tries to peel the glove off because it's now become essentially infected skin. But even though it's a completely separate item that he had to put on, taking it off basically takes his flesh with it. Wild. Very Cronenberg.
Very Cronenberg. So along those lines, because I mean, I've seen all these episodes, but I saw them a long time ago. How did the gore on this episode, do you think it compared to episodes that you've seen? I imagine it was more Cronenberg-y regardless, but did you feel like suddenly it's like, oh, this is at a whole different level of gore that we haven't seen?
Honestly, no. I mean, the beheadings in the previous episode 11, Scarecrow, were not the most violent thing I've seen, but just seeing a severed head on television was surprising.
Yeah.
I think the Great Montaro episode, you couldn't see like the bodies being pierced with the swords, but I do seem to recall a nearly shining level amount of blood gushing out of that casket when the swords penetrated it. Conversely, contrary-wise, yes, the Cronenberg body horror element is there. You might make a good point. I mean, it's very brief, but it does get pretty gory when he starts to peel his own hand off. So I could see some argument for this actually being the goriest thing we've seen so far.
Well, and it's like a parasite, I guess, right? Which is sort of also a theme that Cronenberg explores a lot in his body horror, where your biology and your anatomy and your human flesh gets mixed in with other elements around it. Flesh combining with technology, combining with perhaps an inanimate object like a VHS tape or something. Why are we weirded out by it when it's in this state but not that state? Why are we weirded out by it when it's doing these things under this circumstance but not that circumstance? It's a point of interest that runs throughout his body of work. And as much as it's not his show, he brings that point of view to anything he works on, including this show.
Yeah, horror films are no stranger to the carnal, but it's always sort of an afterthought, whereas Cronenberg actually focuses on the body as a subject of horror itself.
Again, despite all of its faults and different things, it was very daring for its time. That this is on your local broadcast TV. It's on NBC or ABC or CBS in most places. It's on at a weird time, but this is in the middle of satanic panic. This is in the middle of parent-teacher groups wanting to protect the children and things like that. This is years before networks were refusing to show NYPD Blue because of Dennis Franz's butt. And that same network might have been showing this 5 years earlier.
I feel bad repeating myself every single episode. I know people are getting tired of hearing me say, I can't believe it has this, or I can't believe it did that, but it's always true. I'm being honest. I really can't believe it. I can't think of anything else that I saw back then that really even comes close.
Even beyond the horror element, even beyond the gore element, even beyond the sexual element, there's episodes, and some you haven't probably gotten to yet, that really push the sexuality on television angle a lot for 1987.
Well, let's not even get into the relationship between Mickey and Ryan right now, because we'll be here all night.
Oh, yeah. No, that is still something I'm so unclear on, like what the thought and strategy was behind it. Beyond all those things that was ahead of its time on, or really pushing the envelope on in terms of television, it's about the devil. It's something that, to this day, something people push against.
Absolutely. I brought that up in the very first episode of the podcast. They're throwing around terms like diablerie and deucins, which I actually had to look up, as I've never heard that term in my life.
Yeah, it has to be given credit for being that bold and for getting away with it and for pushing that envelope. And anytime you feel like you didn't push it enough in some way, or sort of push it in a silly way, kind of got to remind yourself at this time how incredible it was to see something like that on TV.
I believe it was George Lucas who said, podcasts are never finished, they're only abandoned. And this episode is no exception. In fact, it's a new record. Didn't even make it to the first commercial break. Well, with the introductions out of the way, next week we'll dive in right where we left off and try to make up some lost ground. Plus, we'll each share our curio of the week, which is branding I'm sticking with, even though this show has never come out on a weekly basis. So join us then. Thanks for listening, everyone. We know you have a lot of choices when choosing a Friday the 13th the Series podcast, and we sincerely thank you for choosing ours. Special thanks to Joshua Romeo for original music and to Stephen Yu for original art. And be sure to check out the Joe on Joe podcast, the only podcast where Joe Schlepsky discusses G.I. Joe. If you want to support our show, you can leave a review and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. If you want an occasional update on our projects, you can sign up for our newsletter at the Inner Demon Entertainment website. And if you want to complain about social media with us on social media, you can find links on our website. And always remember what Carl said to Frylock. It don't matter. None of this matters.
Good night, everybody.